Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me here this afternoon. This Asia Society program is my 7th program for today, and I still have one program to go, but it is still fewer than my program last week, because last week, every day, I had around 12 until 16 meetings in a day, so this week is a little bit calmer compared to last week. And this is also my first visit to Asia Society, so thank you very much once again for the invitation. I arrived in New York last week for the high-level week of the UN General Assembly, and this is also the very last leg of Indonesia campaign for the UN Security Council for 2019-2020. So wish us luck for that. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, when I mentioned about the how busy we are all in the UN GA, we have to attend, of course, the UN GA itself, the regional groupings, the bilateral meetings, and I have so far more than 50 bilateral meetings. So it shows that how active we are trying to engage bilaterally, regionally, and multilaterally, again, to try to contribute something for the world peace, security, and prosperity. So my purpose, my presence here today is to share with you, one is how Indonesia foreign policy works and strive to contribute. And then the second one is how is the situation in the region, especially in Southeast Asia. First, Indonesian foreign policy. Ladies and gentlemen, I think all of you knows that Indonesia is a very diverse country with more than 255 million people, the largest economy in Southeast Asia. Our economy grows above average of the world growth, and politics is stable. Indonesia priority is now focusing on the development, especially the infrastructure development. So the development principle of President of the Republic of Indonesia, President Jokowi, is development started from the east to the west and from the village to the city. Because in the past, we are too concentrated our development on Java Island. Java is one of the biggest islands, but not the biggest island in Indonesia. But in terms of inhabitant, the 60% of the population of Indonesia lives in Java Island. So the president changed the approach, want to develop Indonesia as the whole Indonesia, from west to east, from north to south, from village to city, with one aim, that is to distribute the benefit of the development equally to all Indonesian people. So the development is no more Javanese-centric, but Indonesian-centric. Again, this is the approach of the current administration. So why, again, this approach is very important? I would like to repeat again, to distribute equal benefit of development to all Indonesian people. Now, on the foreign policy. What is the basis of Indonesian foreign policy? Independent and active foreign policy, with one aim, to contribute to the world peace and prosperity. And this is clearly mandated by our constitution, Indonesian constitution. So what is now the priority of the foreign policy of Indonesia? At least we have 4 priorities in our foreign policy. One is protecting our national territorial integrity. Second, protecting Indonesian living abroad, because we have millions Indonesian living and working abroad. And this is the priority, to give the maximum protection. And the third one is the strengthening economic diplomacy. Of course, everybody will agree, and that is what every country does, is strengthening the economic diplomacy, because after all, the bread and butter of the bilateral relation always goes for the economic relation. And the fourth priority is the strengthening Indonesia's role in the region and beyond. And I will focus my statement, my remarks on the fourth priority, that is the Indonesia role in the region and beyond. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the world has become more uncertain now. Sentiment of anti-globalization and stronger protectionism are increasing. Tension occurs in many parts of the world. The old tension, we could not solve it yet, while in many other parts of the world, the new tension emerged. And one tension is there, then it's very difficult. It's not easy, at least. It's not easy to end or to solve the tension. Now I would like to focus on where Indonesia lives. That is the Southeast Asia region, where ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, unites 10 member countries. So in Southeast Asia, we have ASEAN. ASEAN, we have 10 member countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, the Philippines, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Brunei Darussalam, and Myanmar. This year, ASEAN celebrates its 50th anniversary. And compared to other regions, Southeast Asia is relatively peaceful and prosperous. And ASEAN contributes a lot in creating the ecosystem for peace, stability, and prosperity. I remember when ASEAN was born half century ago. No one will believe that ASEAN still survives 50 years later, now. There was much pessimism on ASEAN, which was valid at that time. At that time, 50 years ago, almost every member country of ASEAN, well, we started with the 5 founding members, almost every member country has its own conflict with one another. This is Southeast Asia is also a region of diversity, differences in many things: economic progress, political system, ideology, culture, geographical size, and also religious. So we are all different. The 10 members are all different. From the failed prediction of Balkan of Asia, ASEAN turned to become the anchor of stability, an engine of growth in Southeast Asia. And last week, the ASEAN foreign ministers had a meeting with the UN Secretary General, and Secretary General Guterres mentioned and expressed his appreciation on ASEAN contribution, especially in preventing tension and crisis from escalation. There are, of course, recipes behind every success, including of ASEAN. First, ASEAN has its own way of thinking, or as we like to call it, the ASEAN way. So whenever you see ASEAN meeting, in every meeting, then we will start with taking picture, photo, family photo, and then we do the ASEAN way. So we said that no picture, no meeting. Always start with taking picture, family picture together. The ASEAN has adopted a habit of dialogue, consensus, inclusivity, informality, respect to sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-interference, peaceful settlement of dispute, as well as non-use of force. Too many meetings that I attended. Many quarters, I realized that many quarters criticize that ASEAN way is not a progressive way. This might be right. ASEAN way is not a progressive way. But in Dutch we call it maar. What is the benefit of being a very progressive if it will only end up with friction, conflict, and even war? Second, from the ASEAN way, ASEAN was able to develop institutions that emphasize the maintenance of peace, security, and stability, such as in ASEAN. We have Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, SOPFUN. We have the Tree of Amity and Cooperation, which many countries exceeded the TEC. Not only the ASEAN countries, including the big or major powers acceded to TEC. And of course, we have ASEAN Charter and now become one ASEAN community. And third, what is the recipe of ASEAN? ASEAN provides a platform for major powers and key partners to meet and discuss current issues through the ASEAN-led mechanism. So the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit, and the ASEAN Plus One is, among others, the ASEAN-led mechanism. For the AAS, for example, this is, I think, this very unique forum where all major players, starting from the United States, Russia, China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN, we are all there in one forum, and we discuss about difficult issue there. What does it mean? It means that ASEAN is able to provide platform for mainstreaming the culture of dialogue. It's not easy to mainstream the culture of dialogue nowadays. Ladies and gentlemen, the success in politics and security of ASEAN allowed more progress in the economic field. ASEAN is able to create a good ecosystem for prosperity. The current level of ASEAN economy is only a dream for those who live in the 1960s, when we just started, 67, when we started ASEAN. It is unimaginable. One example, in the year 60s, Indonesia encountered 600% inflation rate in 1965, just 2 years before we established ASEAN. But today, look at ASEAN. The third largest economy in Asia after China and India. We are ASEAN, the seventh largest economy in the world, with collective GDP growth projected to continue to outpace global growth. Economic integration continues to reach 6 partners. So we are one community, one economic community, but we would like to expand the economic integration and reach 6 other partners: Australia, New Zealand, India, China, Japan, ROK. We are still negotiating what we call the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP. Hopefully, somewhere, if not this year, then next year, we will be able to conclude this negotiation on the RCEP. Because if we are able to conclude this negotiation, we are talking about how many people? Billion people living in the 16 countries. And with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, economic integration will deepen with a modern, high quality, and of course, last but not least, mutually beneficial. So, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, to stay relevant and contribute more toward peace and prosperity, ASEAN must address the following challenges. So we have also challenges that we have to address, we have to face. First challenge is how ASEAN can cope with geopolitical rivalries. This is the most and pressing challenge for ASEAN. One of the hot issues that always emerge in ASEAN meetings is the situation in South China Sea. You all know that. Question now is how ASEAN could contribute in maintaining peace and stability in South China Sea. China is, of course, ASEAN's most important partner in managing South China Sea. Almost half of ASEAN member countries, 4 countries, have overlapping claims with China in South China Sea. Therefore, working together with China is a must. Working together on the basis of international law, including UNCLOS 1982. That is very important principle. Therefore, we continue to work together through the ASEAN-China mechanism, and I'm pleased to inform you that we concluded the framework of Code of Conduct by ASEAN and China that was adopted last month, August, during the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Manila. And this is a new milestone in diplomatic process that began 25 years ago. But this is not just the beginning. But this is just the beginning, because ASEAN and China must have strong commitment to expedite the conclusion of the Code of Conduct. So the framework, we agreed the framework, we initiated the framework, Indonesia proposed the framework and then agreed and developed by the ASEAN countries, and then of course negotiated with China, and now we have the framework. The challenge now is how we could expedite the negotiation on the Code of Conduct itself. The second challenge is how ASEAN addresses the transnational organized crime. So the ability of ASEAN to address transnational organized crime, including terrorism, is or will determine whether ASEAN will survive or not. Threat of terrorism, security and Sulu water, drug trafficking, human trafficking, IU facing are among the most obvious challenges in Southeast Asia. And let me take just one example dealing the threat of ISIS-linked terrorism, such as one in Marawi City. And I think my colleague Alan Cayetano already mentioned about it when he was here. And Indonesia, to respond to the Marawi situation, Indonesia took the initiative to establish sub-regional mechanism. Trilateral meeting with Malaysia and the Philippines, that was on June. And then we also initiated and hosted the sub-regional cooperation with Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, the Philippines, Brunei Darussalam on foreign terrorist fighter and cross-border terrorism. So within the ASEAN context and on top of the ASEAN Convention on Counterterrorism, ASEAN also has cooperation with 9 dialogue partners. However, more still need to be done. The third challenge is how to ensure that ASEAN prosperity is enjoyed by all people of ASEAN. We have to ensure the people center of ASEAN, reducing the welfare gap within and among the member countries. That is very important, because this is very important element to develop the we feeling of ASEAN. And here, the connectivity is key. ASEAN should continue to implement the ASEAN Connectivity Master Plan 2025 and strengthen the infrastructure development. And finally, another challenge facing by ASEAN is maintaining unity and centrality of ASEAN. Key in dealing with all the challenges. Otherwise, Southeast Asia could become another proxy ground for major powers. Therefore, Indonesia continuously strives to emphasize the importance of unity and centrality in all ASEAN meetings at all levels. For unity and centrality is not given, it must be nurtured. Distinguished participants, while we are focusing on Southeast Asia region, one of the newest challenges that Southeast Asia faces right now is, of course, like Tom mentioned, the humanitarian situation in Rakhine State, and of course, its impact to the neighbor, Bangladesh. I don't know whether let me respond the question on it, or shall I convey it now? I think it's better if we discuss the situation in Rakhine State during the Q&A, because I already took 25 minutes. I must stop here and then give the time for Q&A. And once again, I would like to conclude, peace can never be taken for granted. It must be nurtured. It must be fought. However, based on our experience in the region, a global ecosystem of peace and stability is doable. So if people said that creating ecosystem of peace and stability is not doable, for me, it's wrong. It is doable, but it must be nurtured. It's not a given. It's not a given. We have to fight for it. And through the global partnership, including through the UN mechanism and in collaboration among friends, inshallah, we will be able to see a better world for all of us. And there also remains ample room for further cooperation, of course, between Indonesia, ASEAN, and the US. We look forward to re-strengthen our cooperation with the US and the rest of the countries in order to build a global ecosystem of peace and stability. So I thank you very much.
Minister Marsudi, thank you so much for joining us here at the Asia Society. It's both a pleasure and an honor, and I've had the honor of working with you since you came to office, first as Assistant Secretary of State and then now here at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Congratulations on your great honor at the UNGA, Agent of Change.
Thank you.
Good luck in 2019 in the effort to rejoin the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member. Indonesia has a lot to offer. What the Indonesian foreign minister does not have a lot of, however, is time, unfortunately. And so anyone who has a question card filled out, please be sure to share it with one of the staff. Just hold it up. I'll do my best to integrate your questions into the short time that we have available. You've already touched on a number of important issues, Indonesia's economic, social, and foreign policy priorities, the tremendous importance of ASEAN and its 50th year, and the role that it plays both as an anchor of stability and as an engine of growth, as you put it. The threats to stability from the behavior in the South China Sea, from transnational threats, particularly terrorism, and I'd like to dig down on that and the situation in Rakhine State. So, as you mentioned, Indonesia is a huge country with a population of over 255 million people. It's the world's largest Muslim majority nation, the world's third largest democracy, and more importantly, from my point of view, a nation with an extraordinary record of religious tolerance, of pluralism, of multiculturalism, of strong, vigorous, thriving, stable democracy that really brings home the coexistence between Islam and democracy and strong institutions. That's very important. But my question, Minister, is that under threat now? Is that under threat from ISIS and from ISIS-linked organizations and that ideology which have found some resonance in some of the indigenous groups, including in Indonesia and clearly elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and particularly in Marawi, where the Philippines is engaged in a serious battle, not just with insurgents, not just with rebels, but with people who are linked to ISIS. And as you touched on, the polarization between the Buddhist and Hindu community and the Muslim minority in Rakhine State. What is Indonesia doing to meet this challenge? How do you see this challenge?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Dan. Two things from Dan's. One is the threat of terrorism in Southeast Asia, and the other one is on the situation in Rakhine State. So let me start with the threat of terrorism in Southeast Asia. This morning and this afternoon, I discussed also with the some countries about threat of terrorism in the region. We know that after the situation in Syria and Iraq changed, then we anticipated that there will be a movement from Iraq, Syria to the region. So we call it the regionalization of threat of terrorism. And it happens in Southeast Asia. So basically, there is no country, there is no region that immune from the threat of terrorism. And threat of terrorism is a cross-border issue. If it is cross-border, means that the only thing that we can address the issue is through the international cooperation. So that's why, as I mentioned to you in my remarks or my statement, that right after Marawi was attacked by a terrorist group, the local terrorist group, which had link with the international networking, then Indonesia initiated the trilateral cooperation. Of course, in ASEAN, we have the convention of ASEAN Convention in Countering Terrorism, but and we have the cooperation, of course, but to cope or to respond to the emergency situation, then we have to take an emergency response. That is, among others, by having the trilateral cooperation plus the sub-regional. So we are strengthening all effort to international cooperation, regional cooperation to respond to this threat. Until now, that is based on my communication with, of course, my colleagues in the Philippines, that Marawi is still under what's called occupation. So Marawi is not free yet after 4 months, because the terrorist group used the human shield with them. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's very difficult for the government to free Marawi, to free the people. And in terms of the IDPs, Marawi has around 250,000 people, but the number of IDPs reach around 400,000 people.
These are internally displaced people.
Yeah, the IDPs is internally displaced people. So we try also to help, to assist, to cooperate the Philippines, how to deal also with the IDPs issue. Mm-hmm. When Marawi is freed, then we have also to think about how to rebuild Marawi after that conflict. But on top of that, issue of kidnapping on the Sulu waters and its surrounding is also very obvious. And that is for why Indonesia is trying to contribute by initiating the trilateral cooperation. Now we are having the joint patrol in the Sulu waters and its surrounding. Now on the Rakhine State, colleagues, 2 weeks ago, I have to fly from Jakarta to Yangon, from Yangon to Naypyidaw, from Naypyidaw back to Yangon, from Yangon to Dhaka, from Dhaka to Singapore to Kuala Lumpur. Why I did that? Because I feel Indonesia has the responsibility to contribute, to help the people, the Muslim people, all the people in Rakhine State, to help Myanmar to cope with the situation, to help Bangladesh to cope with the situation. The situation is very challenging. The complexity is there. I mean, if you look at Myanmar, then we see that Myanmar is a very diverse country. And the communal relation sometimes is also challenging, not only in Rakhine State, but also in other parts of Myanmar. I met with the Commander-in-Chief, I met with Daw Aung Suu Kyi, I met with the 3 ministers, and Indonesia sent a very clear message. First, of course, we deeply concerned about the humanitarian crisis that happened in Rakhine State. And I told Daw Suu that I bring the hope of the international community that the humanitarian crisis should be prevented from deteriorating. We are trying to assist also, for example, because of the communal tension is still very high. Now we are trying to communicate with the communal leader, religious leader, and request them to use their influence to ease the tension. Because if the communal tension is there, then it will be very difficult for the assistance, the humanitarian assistance, to reach those who badly needed it. So during my meeting with my colleagues in Myanmar, I bring what I call the formula 4+1. 1 is peace and stability. 2nd is maximum self-restraint and no use of force. 3rd is protection for all, regardless religious and ethnicity. 4 is access to humanitarian assistance. +1 is the implementation of Kofi Annan report. So this 4th is actually the reset button. We have to reset, to push the reset button, to bring the situation back to normal first by these 4 elements, and to make or to solve the problem in a longer term, then the implementation of Annan report will help.
Minister, one of the important elements of your 4+1 plan is that humanitarian assistance should not be limited to one ethnic group, not only to Muslims, not only to Rohingya, but should be and has to be distributed to all the communities on an equal basis.
Yeah.
And one of the questions we got today, and I keep hearing, is when you spoke to Aung San Suu Kyi, did you come away feeling that there's more that she could and should be doing? Because she's the object of a lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of criticism in the West.
When I met Dosu, and this is not my first meeting, remember that last year, October, there was also a cycle of violence happened in Rakhine State. December, I flew to Rakhine State. I even flew to Rakhine State. I flew to Cox's Bazar, the refugee camp in Bangladesh. So I can see by my own eyes how is the situation there. And I was also proposed at that time to Myanmar government to have the ASEAN meeting. That is the new it's not the new tradition, but this is for the first time that ASEAN sit and discuss a situation that happening in member countries. Of course, still with upholding all the principle. And from my conversation with Dosu, I still see the intention of Dosu to follow up. I mean, I give you 2 examples. 2 things. That is on the humanitarian assistance, and then the second one is on the implementation of Annan report. I had a lengthy discussion with Dosu on these 2 important issues. On the the humanitarian assistance, when I discussed with her, then he said that, okay, for the humanitarian assistance, it's open for the international help, led by government, in cooperation with Red Cross movement, including ICRC. Then we discussed about the ASEAN involvement in this relief. So we discussed it with Dosu. And then on the Annan, we discussed also how to implement this recommendation. There is 88 recommendation in Annan report. And it was submitted by Mr. Annan on the 24th of August. And the government of Myanmar accepted this recommendation and has the commitment to implement it. So that's why they established a committee to implement. The problem is that, to be very honest, there is gap of communication between the civilian government and the military. So we have to see that, and we have to convey the message also to the military, because without support of the military, even on the humanitarian assistance, then that will be difficult to distribute, to deliver the humanitarian assistance. So that's why when I talk to Commander-in-Chief, I talk a lot on these 2 issues. Humanitarian, because I don't want to see more victims, and the situation is getting worse. I don't want to see that. And of course, the implementation, and we have to, again, to engage more on the military.
Well, Minister, certainly given the limits to what Daw Aung San Suu Kyi can do as state counselor with the military, which has the control and the authority over the security situation, I think your assessment is valid, that it's important for the international community and particularly for Myanmar's neighbors to not only talk directly with the Burmese military, but also to help make clear both that you stand ready to help, and secondly, that they are putting not only Myanmar but the region at risk by opening the door to the radicalization of a minority within the country. If I could shift quickly to another area, I know that you're pressed for time. We'll have to check the handwriting later to see if it was your perm rep to the UN, Ambassador Jani, who asked this question. I'm gonna make it a two-part question. What are Indonesia's priorities in the UN Security Council? What is it that you would help the Council focus on? And a little sooner than 2019, our hope and expectation is that, as Vice President Pence told you and told the ASEAN Secretary General when he visited Jakarta in the spring, President Trump is expected to participate in the ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit in November. Kevin Rudd and others in the Asia Society wrote, I think, an important report about strengthening the East Asia Summit. What is it that ASEAN should try to get done this year with the United States, with President Trump? What would be the agenda items that you would hope that you'd be able to focus on in a U.S.-ASEAN meeting and in the East Asia Summit?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much. Before I come to those two questions, I want to add just a little bit still on the Rakhine. What we need to see is there is a progress. There is a progress in Rakhine State, then the international community can see that there is, again, a progress. Because if there is no progress, then it's very difficult for us also to help. What will be the priority of Indonesia if we were elected as the non-permanent member of the UN Security Council? There are three. One, again, as I mentioned in my remarks, we would like to create an ecosystem of peace and stability. This is very important, and this is very expensive exercise. And for that, Indonesia already contribute a lot in creating the ecosystem for peace and stability. Indonesia is one of the largest contributor for peacekeeping operation within UN. If you look at when we started contributing on the peacekeeping operation, it was in 1957 until now, there are already more than 38,000 troopers, peacekeepers of Indonesia. And in the last couple of years, we already deployed more than 2,700 peacekeepers, and within 1 year, we are now preparing another deployment of 1,040 new peacekeepers. Second is how to synergize between peace and development. And especially, it relates to SDGs 2030. That is very important, to link peace and development. Last priorities is countering the transnational organized crime, including terrorism, radicalism, violent extremism, drugs, people smuggling, and many more. So that is the priorities when Indonesia was elected as the UN member, non-permanent member of UN Security Council. Now in ASEAN and US. First, of course, we appreciate very much the intention of the new administration of US to remain engaged ASEAN. When we have the ASEAN meeting, August in Manila, the Secretary Rex Tillerson was there, attended the ARF, the EAS meeting, plus ASEAN +1 meeting. So it shows the commitment of US to continue its engagement with ASEAN. And you mentioned when Vice President Pence visited Jakarta, he also mentioned the plan of President Trump to attend the ASEAN summit in November in Manila. I think if we are able to continue partnership, the strategic partnership between ASEAN and US, it will bring benefit not only for ASEAN, but also for US. We are talking about 640 million people living in the 10 countries of ASEAN. Stability, political stability is there. The growth of ASEAN is above the world growth. So you can trade in a good deal with the ASEAN countries. So I think ASEAN has a strategic position and deserve to get attention from the US, because I'm sure that the relation will bring benefit not only for ASEAN, but also for the United States. Thank you, Danny.
Well, thank you very much, Minister. We greatly appreciate your time, your candor. I know that the 8th group that you're committed to speak to today will be mad at me if I keep going, so I won't, other than to thank you not only for this great presentation, not only for your tremendously valuable work on the challenge of Rakhine State, on the threat from violent extremism and radicalism, not only for your great diplomatic efforts, but also I should mention your very, very strong statement earlier in September condemning North Korea's nuclear test, its program, its illegal behavior. And also, although you touched on it, your valiant, vigorous support for the rule of law, and particularly adherence to the principles of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, making the case that not only in terms of Natuna, not only in terms of Indonesia's national interests, but in the interests of the region and the world, that all countries, big, small, strong, weak, must be bound by their legal commitments and must find peaceful, constructive solutions to territorial and to maritime disputes. So thank you.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
And we look forward to having you back in New York before too long.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.